looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family.
Well, Nick, here we are. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Busy with lots of exciting things as we're going to talk about as we go through this pod.
Yes, you're listening to, as you didn't already know, you're listening to Islands at War, our bi-month account of the German occupation of the Channel Islands, obviously during the Second World War. I'm Keith Bengelli, and I'm joined by, as always, by my co-presenter, Nick Lahuri. And we now, Nick, in December 1940, I'd just like to say to listeners at the top of the programme that we've been contacted by a few people, Kester, Kerry and Charlie, and we'll address their points as we meander through the programme. But the big story that is hanging over December is the fate of the civilians, Nick, that were incarcerated in France in the wake of the spies Nicolle and Symes being... I've got the names right, haven't I?
You have.
Yeah. So, sort of talking about them, hit a bit of a mental block. Anyway, yes, so we have the two spies incarcerated in Cherchez-Midi prison in Paris, then joined by various civilians, Nick, notably Sherwell, Guernsey's Attorney General, who had helped the two lads, Symes and Nicolle, surrender themselves to the German forces in Guernsey. I'd like you, Nick, to talk us through the experiences of the in prison of the civilians. It was a pretty gruesome place. But if we can kick off with Sherwell, because Sherwell was a leading Channel Islander, viewed with a little bit of suspicion by the Germans, but he was sort of sent to Paris, where he almost got a VIP treatment, didn't he?
Yeah, they took him by air on his own. He didn't travel with the others. This was seen to be because they regarded him as sort of a person of importance, of high value. So they took him on his own. The plane touched down on the way to France. Sorry, on the way to Paris. They touched down in Brittany. On their way up to Paris, where he was treated very well by his interpreter, put up in a very top hotel in Paris, and taken out for dinner, allowed to go out for walks and things. Then he asked if he could actually go and see some French people that he knew who ran a restaurant. This suddenly sort of seemed to change the mood, and he wasn't allowed to go and see them. Then a couple of days later, he finds himself banged up in Versailles prison before they then transfer him to Cherchez-Midi prison. Now, being put in the prison at Cherchez-Midi was a big shock to the system for anyone. This probably goes to one of Kerry's questions that he asked earlier, in terms of why did they do it. It was because he was high value. It was seen as a punishment, taking them out of the island, the uncertainties that would cause them, maybe get them to talk more. But when he arrived at Cherchez-Midi prison, he found it was extremely cold. The food was really, really bad. He records in some notes that I looked at the Island Archives last week that he was grateful that his wife Mary had insisted that he took a fur coat with him, because he was able to get relatively warm at night by covering himself with this fur coat, albeit he was on a straw mattress which had been in use for so long that the bits of straw were all broken, and he said you could feel the floor, the boards of the beds.
Yeah, one of the things that comes over to me here is that I'm still not convinced that the Germans themselves really really knew what to do with these people. Guernsey really took its lead from Paris. Paris possibly were in contact with Berlin, but there seemed to be no clear plan, and there was an incredible gear change in the way that he had been treated vis-a-vis his stay in the hotel. Then suddenly, bang, he's locked up in the prison, and it's almost as if someone said, no, we're not going to treat these people with that much respect. Well, certainly sure will. We're going to make sure there's a certain degree of suffering here. But this was, we must remind ourselves, this is only December 40. Okay, yes, the war itself had been going on for more than 12 months, obviously from the start in 1939. But the Germans don't really have a sort of protocol. It's all sort of made up as they go. They don't quite know how much they want the people to suffer.
Yeah, and another reason that they sort of seem to handle this in a very odd way. It's very disjointed. They take some of the people that are taken to Cherché-Midi are taken all together. They're taken to Paris as well. In terms of getting a bit of a tour around Paris in that bizarre photograph we talked about last month, before they're put into this horrible prison. They really just kind of didn't know what to do with them. But I think they deported them partly because they'd put all these warnings in the paper about, if you disobey us, or help anybody that's from the British forces or anything like that, then you will be deported. So I don't think they had a lot of choice. Otherwise, people would just think, oh well, then they don't really mean it.
Yes, I mean the Cherché-Midi prison. We're judging it by what we know now. It wasn't a very pleasant place at all, and gained some notoriety later in the war with the way that French resistance people were tortured, held there, tortured, and executed. But that's later on in the war. But we'll return to Sherwell, but we must mention the fact that people like Wilfrid Bird, who was a states official, and Emile and Frank Nicolle, but both civil servants, they suffered along with Sherwell, and these people all suffered a bit of professional retribution on their return back to the island. But I know that you've been doing some digging at the local archives, and tell me a little bit more about Sherwell's account. It's typewritten, but we think, you and I, there's a lovely immediacy about it. We think he was writing this as he went.
Yeah, I think probably, as we discussed earlier, probably made some notes, or it's recorded fresh from his memory. But he writes day by day. It's just some about 13 bits of typewritten paper that they've got there, and he just annotates what's happened, even if nothing's happened. There are a lot of days where it says nothing happened, or nothing happened other than we were allowed out for 10 minutes into the yard to gather straw for our mattresses. He records that he got hold of an American travel book to read, which would hopefully relieve the boredom. His cell was 6 feet long, wide and 13 feet long, and had a rudimentary washing facilities. He actually managed to plug his electric razor into the light socket and managed to get it working.
Yeah, there's a lovely bit.
While.
Yeah, there's a lovely bit where he said, "I enjoyed my shave."
Yeah, that's how horrible it was. He sometimes Sundays were the worst day for food. He records in that. They just often got very, very little. There was usually no meat on a Sunday. Don't know why, but they were clearly, as well as obviously a hard prison regime. He seems to think that there's already food problems in France.
Yeah, so looking at some of the items that you've turned up at the Ireland Archives, here is an entry for the 9th of December 1940, Monday. And this is Sherwell's notes. Monday, visited by Inspector, who is hopeful that there be no trial, and all except officers will be released and returned to Guernsey. So what he's saying there basically is the military guys will go off to the POW camps, The civilians will be returned home. Inspector, charming, friendly and sympathetic. Last Friday I put in a statement and pleading, running to 9 sheets of foolscap, and he told me he translated it into German on Sunday afternoon and placed it in the dossier. He thought it set out the case from my point of view very thoroughly. So Sherwell, being a legal mind, this inspector he's referring to, this would be German military police?
Yeah.
Okay, so this would have been somebody based in Paris, not someone from Guernsey, flown to. So
no, it was somebody from Paris.
So he's making representation to the Paris base officials, and this is why it makes me think that it was a little bit disjointed, because there are people here in Paris, there are these people from this little island offshore. There doesn't seem to be any great degree of consistency running through this. And then again here, carrying on through Sherwell's notes, rumour of the women, this is the ladies that have been transported, women to go to Guernsey, men in internment camps. So he's thinking that possibly the civilian men would go off, including himself, would go off to an internment camp. Marcon, very downhearted. This is a guy that was a senior civil servant, and Sherwell can see that Marcon's experiences in the prison were not having the greatest effect with him. Sherwell goes on to say, I am fairly bright, but would have preferred prison sentence and then home. And then again, this immediacy turns up. It's almost staccato. One sentence, then another sentence. Definitely told women going home. No news, but men hope. Guernsey held out. Very staccato. Give Mrs. Nicolle affection messages for May and financial advice for Bird and Alan. So he's writing down all these little messages he's being given. And then he says, get our belongings, then told whole party to Guernsey. I can't quite believe it. Then told officiously, given hot sweetened coffee and bread. Everybody kind and helpful and friendly. And there's this thing here, Nick, where he says, the terror of our corridor shakes hands and bids me a friendly farewell. So it sounds like some sort of jailer there that's been pretty offhand with them. And then sort of, a switch is flicked and, you're going home. Well, good for you.
It's very odd, isn't it? And of course, tragically, one of the people that didn't get to come home was Louis Symes, who
father of one of the two military guys.
Yeah, sadly, he died in his cell just before Christmas, so he wasn't able to come back. Now, there's a lot around exactly what happened to him. I know if you listen to James Symes's interview on the Imperial War Museum website, he talks about having a whole folder about what had happened, and he seemed to be of the view that his father was hit by a German and it was all covered up. He wasn't a well man anyway, so I can imagine being in prison like that and badly treated, but it certainly sounds like there was a jailer there, at least one, that was meting out a few beatings and things like that from other things that I've read about it.
Yes, and so this tragedy is still controversial to this day. And as we record this, we're recording this just 2 days after our 79th anniversary of liberation. So it's somebody who would have been in our thoughts around this time. Okay, and the other thing we discussed is it's highly likely that the civilians were actually imprisoned in Symes Midi at the very same time as the two combatants, but they never met, did they?
No, they didn't. Not during that time. The men were kept in separate cells, both the civilian men and the two military guys. The women were put in cells of two together, so at least they had some company.
Yep.
But the guys couldn't communicate really with anybody, although there was a bit of tapping on pipes going on to relay messages through between the cells, but obviously they couldn't physically see each other.
Okay, so the group were eventually released on the 29th of December 1940 and made their way back to Guernsey. We all recall as well that the whole population of Guernsey, all of the people that had wirelesses were punished en masse as well by having the wirelesses, their radios, withdrawn by the German forces. But then I think there was a notice put in the local paper on Christmas Eve that the radios would be returned to their owners.
Yeah, it was a notice around what was happening with Sherwell and the other civilians, and what was happening to Symes and Nicolle themselves. And as part of, so actually they knew in Guernsey, if they picked up a copy of the Guernsey Press on the 25th of December, they knew 5 days before the actual people that were being returned to Guernsey knew they were being returned to Guernsey. But part of that notice was that the wireless sets would be returned. They were distributed by postmen who worked Christmas Day and Boxing Day to get them all back to people.
Yes, this event brought so much joy back to people at Christmas time. It features in a great many diaries that have been published since the war. This feeling that they would be back in touch with their loved ones for Christmas. The great universal bond being, of course, the listening to the King's speech. And there's a wonderful account in one of the diaries where, I think it's Joyce Carey's diary, where she has some help from a neighbour to get the radio up and running, and the very first thing she hears is the King's speech. And it's very, it can be difficult nowadays to imagine the importance of that, but it especially around this time, our Liberation Day period, it was the universal bond for Guernsey people to listen to the King, and knowing that their friends and loved ones in the UK were in turn listening to the King. It was this wonderful sort of bridge, wasn't it?
Yeah, and of course it was the only way they could get any news about what was going on, other than the German side of the story, or what they could observe going on, around the island. The limited amount of things that they could see going on in terms of aerial activity and air raids on France that were visible from here and things like that.
Yes, and as I mentioned Joyce Carey there, in her diaries, an entry actually made on Christmas Day to the effect that they're discussing, or Joyce is discussing, the whole aspect of these commando raids, and saying, which I think is harsh, but written at the time with feeling, that dreadful Nicolle boy. So the raids were seen at the time not to have been particularly beneficial to Guernsey, and it's a very, very sensitive point there. This should not be interpreted at all that they didn't want to see military action on the islands, but some of the people just saw this as an appalling disruption of their lives here, and they certainly didn't want these raids to continue. This in terms of sending spies back to the island, this was the last time, wasn't it? And I make a distinction between that and pure military raids, which of course we'll cover as we go on.
In intelligence gathering, they were the last ones to come. There'd been a whole host of them in the 6 months in the run up to this, but they were the last to come. Now that you've got to think about how people were viewing this at the time. They had no context for why this raid had happened. They didn't know what was going on in the outside world. I think it's one of those sort of Marmite things, because you can read plenty of other accounts where people are very supportive of the raids, but Sherwell himself in that speech we talked about in August said, will he stop sending these people, because he saw what was happening. It was causing greater restrictions, massive problems. There were whole areas that you couldn't go because barbed wire was put up. They started mining things more so than they had already previously. The curfew, identity cards were brought in, as we talked about last episode of the podcast. It caused massive disruption. So you could see why somebody sat here in 1940 would say, I wish they'd stop doing that, because it's frankly a pain in the neck, because I can't go about my daily business. I'm getting repercussions. I mean, they took the radios away, but they could have, done much worse. I mean, they were threatening to deport people as it was anyway. So, you can kind of see where she was coming from. Then again, if you go and read some of the details of interviews with islanders that escaped from the island, there are several where they're complaining that there weren't any more. And this is later on in the war. There hadn't been more commando raids on the island, and that they hadn't been bombing the RAF hadn't been bombing the island massively to try and get rid of the Germans. So you can't win, really.
No, it was. I suppose it's human life, human nature. The other thing, of course, I picked out is that from Reverend Ord's diaries is that the military police were stopping civilians and inspecting the ID cards. This again is something that British people were just not used to.
Yeah, the whole concept of ID cards, but they did stop people. There were instructions published in the Guernsey Press and in the Star, telling people what to do if they saw a German circling a torchlight. We're making a circle with a torchlight. If they were out at night, that meant you had to stop. Various things like that. People were getting fined for being out without their identity cards. They were really sort of putting their foot down and establishing that we're in control here.
Yeah. Also, another interesting item picked up from Ord's diaries is that there was a rumour that UK Army silver was taken to Germany to be melted down. So this was regimental silver that had been left behind by the retreating British garrison here at the time. Tell us a little bit about that, Nick.
Yeah, so that was 1st Battalion of Royal Fusiliers, who were stationed in Guernsey. They'd been here for a couple of years. They had their regimental silver here, and they were wondering what to do when they were ordered to leave in June 1940. It was a case of, well, what do we do? They decided to leave it here for safekeeping. They put it in the vault at Lloyd's Bank, where it didn't go unnoticed, unfortunately. So during the occupation, Colonel Schumacher, head of civil affairs unions at the Feldkommandantur 515, ordered the removal of the 18 cases of regimental silver from the bank.
18 cases?
Yeah. Ord's rumour was in fact true. However, the bailiff of Guernsey, Victor Carey, and the manager of Lloyd's Bank protested so much the Germans agreed to return all less articles of domestic use that it included 463 Georgian silver knives, forks, spoons, along with various other items, including tea and coffee pots. And nevertheless, these were objects of great sentimental value to the regiment, and they were plundered, possibly sent to Germany. This included a gold and diamond encrusted snuff box, presented to a Captain Robe from the proceeds won at the Mauritius races in 1831. That's never been recovered.
Yeah, this is sort of brings back the sort of cliches of regimental dinners and these sort of objects that were held in extremely high regard by regiments and just shipped off to Germany and dismantled and melted down and
yes.
one thing and another.
They were lucky that the majority of it actually was found on the 26th of May 1945. A British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Somerville, accompanied by Captain Paddy Moyne, not to be confused with Paddy Mayne, arrived in Guernsey, and they went to go and have a look and unpack all the crates and see what was missing, basically.
Yeah, so the Germans didn't make away with all of these items. Okay, moving on to here, we should remind people that due to the evacuation of many families on the island, many local residences and homes were left completely empty, and especially at this early stage of the war, the Germans hadn't moved through them, and did the damage which they later went on to do. But there was a move here for an introduction of the death penalty for plundering evacuated homes. Now, presumably this was outside of military law, Nick. This would have been something that would be deterring locals from breaking into and looting homes that had been evacuated.
Albeit it was an order from the German Commando that brought this about. To be fair, there was a little bit of looting that went on in terms of people taking things. It wasn't that, it wasn't that frequent. And also there was the problem that you had of, if your mate had said to you when he was getting on an evacuation ship, you can have X, Y, and Z from my house, you haven't got any proof of that. So that was a problem. There were Germans though that were undoubtedly taking stuff to ship off island as well. Just to flog it in France, and a few of them got caught out later on in the war. Yeah. I mean, when we arrive at the point where people are being deported to Bibracte and Laufen, this raises its head again, doesn't it? Which we'll cover off. I think at the time, islanders were a bit more desperate and a bit more sort of less inhibited about what we would call looting, but we'll get onto that in context of when people went off to or were deported in 42 and 43. But the controlling committee were even trying to work out what to do with the stuff that was in these houses. They were, did they pass a law to say that it was to be taken and redistributed to people, or did they leave it where it was? That they were very, they just didn't know what to do. Who knew how long the war was going to go on? For all they knew, the war could have finished in 6 months' time, and somebody comes back and says, "Where's all my stuff?" Difficult position to be in. We have to remember there was no rule book for the people that basically got left holding the baby when the Germans arrived, and the British forces had gone. It was just, here you go, chaps, do your best, was the message.
Yes, and this introduce a comment here from listener Kester. Kester writes, "I think if I were a young teenager on the island and found the neighbouring abandoned house to have had a larder with dry foods, a big coat to keep my dear mum warm, and a wireless radio to tune into, I don't think I would hesitate in repatriating those items." So that's a view there from listener Kester. Also, Nick, I'd like to bring in here, Kester also writes, "I also have a question about some of the darker sides of society. Reflecting on the fact that there were many men of fighting age posted to the island away from their wives," we're talking about German military personnel here, Kester writes, "Was there a local brothel? And if so, did the Germans bring in the local madame running such an establishment under their control?" So there wasn't a brothel for civilians here, were there? But there were military-run establishments.
Yeah, there wasn't a local brothel. What happened was the Germans set up their own and brought in women from France to work in those brothels. So if you're listening in Guernsey and you remember the old Bordello restaurant, it was in the vicinity of that building, which one of those was, hence the name of the restaurant at the time.
And also, one of the things, again, I picked up from Ward is that letters were finding their way to the Channel Islands. So this would be people that had been evacuated to the United Kingdom, writing to people in Guernsey, and they were coming seemed to be routed through Portugal, which of course was neutral at the time. Is this an established route, or this is a sort of ad hoc? There seems to be a little bit of mystery about this.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how this happened, to be fair, because it would appear there were some normal letters that got through just in December 1940 from via Portugal. No idea how it happened. These weren't Red Cross letters, which were limited to very short messages. They did often route those through Portugal, but these were just things that came in the post by the looks of it. I have seen some pictures of a letter. I can't tell if it's genuine or not, just from a picture, but it purports to be to have come to the island that way. But I've not seen the original.
Okay, and then we'll pick up a lot on about the Red Cross services to the Channel Islands during the war as we proceed through the series. I also noted here from a Channel Island Occupation Society booklet number 48 for those that wish to track down the full story. But there was an interesting article here about a crash of a seaplane on Alderney, and it's a type that I'd never heard of before, an Arado.
Yeah, it's just it was used by the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, often put onto ships and then craned over the side to operate. So it was it looked, actually, if you look at it and you know what a chipmunk looks like, looks a little bit like that in terms of the cockpit and things like that. But it was a float plane, so it had two floats, and it was used for reconnaissance from German warships. This one crashed due to bad weather up in Alderney. That's it. It wasn't a particularly exciting plane, but I have seen somebody arguing that it's one of the best float planes of World War II. But there you go.
Okay, moving on to more military matters. Here is the RAF were frequently over the islands, and there was quite a lot of activity here. Make a distinction between observation and actual attack. Here, there was a lot of activity to harassing shipping, but the airport was having a new Guernsey airport, which had been obviously requisitioned by German forces. They'd erected a new hangar, and then the RAF attacked it straight away, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. There was quite a lot of activity in 1940 around the islands, and in fact there was a lot of activity around the islands by the RAF in the vicinity. For the whole of the war, really. It's one of the most photographed places, given the size of it. You can go and look at those online. I'll put a link in the show notes so that people can go and have a look if you want to look at some of the photography from later on in the war. Some quite interesting ones. But yeah, they bombed the airport. It was, I haven't been able to track down which squadron it was. To be able to tell exactly what type of aircraft it was probably Blenheims. Probably Blenheims, yeah. Yeah. Based on the other aircraft that were attacking the island at various points, up to that part of the war. The Germans had actually withdrawn a load of aircraft in August after the bombing raid, then by the RAF, but they were building a hangar, and it did get damaged. They put it in between greenhouses. Yes. I also know that with this note, Nick, with this particular raid on the airport, that a 29-year-old man, William George Anderson, a local civilian, was killed. So he was working with German forces again. Could you just explain that, if you were working with German forces, it doesn't in any way mean that you were a collaborator? You were told that if you were going to be working with the Germans, this was something that you could not get out of. And I think the usual route was that the German authorities would say to the local authorities, we need men to do A, B or C, and that the local authorities would then find from the labour pool someone to go and do it. So this poor unfortunate man was killed, and so this was Guernsey labour conscripted by the Germans, and it was forced labour, but not slave labour. People would have been paid, wouldn't they? Yeah, absolutely. They were paid. Basically, the Germans would come along to the local government and say, we want 150 men to go and work on this project. You will provide them. They had no choice. Now, if you were one of those that was picked to be the 150 men to go and do that, you could try and get out of it pretty much unsuccessfully. Because you'd face prison from the Germans for doing so, You could get a note from your doctor. I've seen one of these chap that was being made to work later on in the war on some of the Atlantic Wall fortifications, and he had a note basically saying he was unfit to do that work, and the Germans don't care, and he was made to go back to work. Some people did manage to dodge it. Don't ask me how, but they did manage to dodge it. You know, some of them turned up for a few days and then managed to disappear without going back to work. You might recall we talked in one of the earlier episodes about danger money and the request for it.
Yes.
This sort of attack was one of the reasons why they demanded it.
And of course, just returning to the death of William Anderson, when his funeral took place, the German military had a presence, didn't they? They actually took part in the funeral.
They sent a wreath-laying party of German non-commissioned officers along to lay a wreath at the funeral, which I don't think went down particularly well with the local population.
I think it's just a way of the Germans trying to show a degree of respect to a civilian in the same way that they would have tried to have paid some respects to a military man. But when I read about it, I did raise an eyebrow. But hey ho, there was some humanity shown at that point.
Yes.
Okay, you just touched on also about made reference to the Atlantic Wall. Again, listener Kester's, who was actually talking to me about this as he visited the island, and Kester writes, "You talk of an Atlantic Wall. What does this refer to, please? And also, you frequently refer to the volume of concrete poured in Guernsey during the war. This makes Kester think, how did they obtain the supplies, especially the cement and of high volumes of aggregate?" Kester thought maybe this could have been sourced on the island, but we're leaping a little ahead of ourselves here. Atlantic Wall construction started in late 41, early 42, something like that. Yeah. But it is a point well worth addressing. All of the material that the Germans used in construction, etc., was because of the volume. It was brought over from France, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean they used. We had sand pits here, which were they did extract some sand from there, but predominantly everything was shipped in. They used barges and other shipping to bring it across. This is part of the reason why there was a lot of aerial activity around the islands, because they'd see these things coming from the French coast and attack them. I think I've seen opinions vary about how much of the percentage of the Atlantic Wall, the concrete in the Channel Islands is. It seems to vary between 8 and 10% in terms of how much volume. But if you think about the Mirus battery, for example, that took 47,000 cubic meters of concrete to build that one battery. So it was more than one bunker. You had all sorts of things there. You had the guns, the gun batteries themselves, plus all the support bunkers and water bunkers and the radar and stuff like that. But that's a vast amount of stuff. Now, there are a couple of bunkers that I've seen where they're starting to fall apart. Now, these ones seem to have something in common, and I think they might have been getting a bit desperate for supplies at one point, because the ones where bits are coming off, you can see what looks like just round stones off the beach. So they've obviously improvised because they haven't got the right sort of materials to hand, so they seem to have used those. But as I say, very few and far between. But there do seem to be a couple where bits are just falling off. But I mean, they had all the steel reinforcing to bring in, the massive concrete mixers that they used, which were absolutely huge. And once they started pouring, you couldn't stop. Once the concrete mixer was tipped over, you weren't going to stop pouring it.
Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind, this is something I've been looking at in detail, and excuse me, some of my guided walks address this is that the German fortifications, from the point that they arrived on the island in, let's say, July 1940, up until the point where construction of the Atlantic Wall actually took place, there was it was one of those huge change of gears. But the Germans' fortification ethos, the philosophy, was quite different, Nick, wasn't it, in the first part of the war, whereby it seems to me that they had the cliff areas on the south of the island. They used ignition mines, roll bombs, etc., and predefined mortar pits. So, in other words, in many of the meadows and fields that at the cliff's edge, there would be pits dug, sandbags, etc. And so, in the case of an alarm being called, troops would move into these areas, take possession of them, set up mortars, etc., and seek to stop people invading by climbing the cliffs or coming ashore in the bays. This is quite different to the Atlantic Wall, and one of the things I've seen, Nick, occurring is this resistance nests. This is something that predates the Atlantic Wall. But these resistance nests were spread out through the locality back from the cliffs, more into the hinterland, weren't they?
Yeah, and the term resistance nest was still used when they built the concrete fortifications. So it was 20th October 1941 that Hitler ordered that the Channel Islands be fortified. And they got on with it pretty quick after that. I can't remember when the last bunker was finished, but I think it was the Naval Signals.
I think it must have been
bunker. That must have been 44. Was it?
Yeah, I mean that one there, which is a huge complex that can be visited if anyone comes to the island. But yes, construction there started in September 1943, and it was operational on the 1st of February 1944. And you know that I
knew you'd know the answer to that one.
I've served some time there as an attendant, and one of the comments that I had a lot from people was, well, you know, that was a bit late in the war, but of course we didn't know it was late in the war at that point. But again, returning to my original point, these sporadic resistance nests, some of which bits and pieces can still be located, many are still on private property, etc. But some of them have been ploughed away. But the whole notion of the defence of the island was, if they get ashore, we have places that we would bring the battle to an invader, as opposed to the Atlantic Wall, where invaders were supposed to get absolutely nowhere near the beaches, and if they did, there was all sorts of beach obstacles, and it was a completely different philosophy, wasn't it?
Yeah. So the Atlantic Wall, actually, just before I forget to answer the first part of Kester's question, it ran all the way from Scandinavia down to the border with Spain, the border of France with Spain. So it was a massive fortification. Now it was sparser in some areas than others, but we ended up with more than our fair share of concrete here. But yeah, you're right. They do. You often see photographs from the earlier part of the occupation where you've got gun positions just with sandbags around them. They've just dug a pit and put some sandbags around those. They're just more improvised, like you would have on a normal battlefield. You dig, if it's relatively fast moving battle over a few days, you dig in. That kind of thing was what was done, and then they started mining as well. But
it was still rather sophisticated, though, because if you look at the Festung books, I'm sure you could probably put a couple of those covers up on Facebook. I think it's Clearview Publishing that publish these books as an account of the German fortifications around the island. If you study them, you can see just how interlocked they are. So, like Wilderness Point here at A, the mortars would cover Wilderness Point B. They were sophisticated. They were instituted under a degree of sophistication, even though they were superseded later on.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and you'll find that they put more permanent fortifications where they'd had these temporary ones, but they would have had interlocking fire to try and stop anybody from attacking them. Now, in the early part of the occupation, they weren't always manned 24 hours a day.
Exactly.
When the ambassador raid took place in July 1940, they discovered when they jumped into a gun pit up on the Jerburg headland and found there was nobody in there, and couldn't actually find anybody in the barracks or anything around there, because the Germans at that point didn't have very many troops here and were just moving them about as and when required. Yeah,
I mean, in that area, that was one of the areas that did require some defences, because the Germans took the view that, hey, look, these spies are coming ashore in this part of the island. They did build some rudimentary fortifications, or at least areas of protection for what they were seeking to protect. And I'm thinking particularly of the searchlight housing above Saints Bay.
Yep.
When I was a child, we used to play in all of these bunkers, and of course they weren't even 20. Well, they were only just a little over 25 years old at the time. One visits them now at over 80 years since they were built. Some of them, as you say, are falling into considerable disrepair. You know the one I mean, the one where you can still see the rails where the searchlight went
backwards and forwards.
And these searchlights were huge. I mean, they illuminated the whole area, which is what they were meant to do. But there was a sensitivity about that area, because people had come ashore there, that they were one of the first areas to receive a little bit more than just holes in the ground with a few sandbags, and the initial strength or quality, I suppose, of fortification, the concrete, as you referred to, it's just falling apart. In fact, it's downright dangerous. It is a shame it hasn't been not so much renovated, but preserved. It's a particularly dangerous site to walk around now.
Yeah, there's often this misconception that all of the German fortifications were built by Organisation Todd, but they weren't. Some of the earlier ones were built by German engineering soldiers, the equivalent of Remy, or in fact just some of the battery personnel themselves, building some of those early fortifications.
Yes, because slave workers hadn't been brought over, and in fact the differences between slave workers, Organisation Todd, and local labour is something I think we should we'll get into in a later episode, because people are get a bit confused about what constituted a slave labour, a slave worker, where they came from, and then Organisation Todd, and we'll get into that a little later on. Okay, moving on. We have had an interesting point from a listener, Charlie. I do beg your pardon. Excuse me. Where we were talking about how the authorities were able to bring together many Guernsey born combatants. From it's not like today where you can have computer databases and you bring all of these facts together, but it seems that Charlie's done quite a bit of fantastic research here. So we're regarding how the authorities very quickly were able to bring together people that had a common birth, either here on Guernsey or in Jersey. And Charlie writes, regarding a certain Captain Canton, Cantan, Charlie writes, this man was the adjutant officer of the Royal Guernsey Militia, Captain Harry Canton. He had been a regular army officer in the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry before retiring to Guernsey and joining the militia. So at some point, most likely after the militia was technically disbanded in February 1940, he returned to England and re-enlisted with the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry back on the mainland. And we believe that he had a regular army background, and he must have been on the radar for the higher ups. So this would have been higher echelons of military intelligence, and so he didn't have too much trouble locating him. And Charlie's research has turned up that Canton worked closely with Lieutenant Nicolle. So this would be Lieutenant Nicolle that had come ashore at Guernsey, as Nicolle had served the militia as the militia's sports officer. This is how the Admiralty were able to source so many former militiamen for the early commando raids, spies coming ashore. This alongside the fact that at least 3 men in the early days were serving in the same regiment made locating them relatively simple. So that sort of bit of research there helps us out in one of the things that we were mulling over.
Yeah, absolutely, and as Charlie points out quite rightly there, a lot of them were serving in the Hampshires, so they were relatively easy to locate from that point of view. I'm fairly certain that my late grandfather mentioned Harry Cantan from back in his days pre-war here, before he went off to join the army in the UK. And just the name rings a bell with me from that point of view, and I'm fairly certain he mentioned him. My grandfather was involved in the militia, so it's entirely possible that they did their paths did cross. But just something that just occurred to me actually.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Kerry and Charlie and Kester in getting in touch, raising questions, which is we always like. If any listener wishes to do so, you can email occupied@gnetradio.com. That's occupied@gnetradio.com. Now, Nick, during this month and probably around the time we record the next episode, we might not be able to include that in the next episode. But you're going on Tim Osborne's trip to Sark on the 25th of May, because Tim is a highly regarded guide for military installations here. So tell me a little bit about the trip to Sark with Tim.
Yeah, Tim's got a trip on the 25th of May across.
Or did I say March? I think 25th of May.
25th of May across the Sark. I went on this last year actually at the same time of year, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Tim knows so much about what happened in Sark, and I think everybody on the tour was fascinated by some of the talks. He takes you around. Involves Operation Basalt. Operation Hardtack, and lots of other events that happened, including the Lancaster bomber that crashed into a field there.
Yes, the field is still known as aircraft or airplane field.
Lancaster Field.
Lancaster Field. Yeah. So not something we've scripted for today, but just remind me, this was a Lancaster that thought they were landing in the Isle of Wight.
Yep, they thought they were landing in it. I've stood in that field with Tim. There's not a lot of room to land at Lancaster.
No, I don't know the field in question. Yeah,
it's like, there's not a lot of room to. It's probably the only place they could have actually successfully crash landed. To be fair, in Sark, it's probably the longest bit of level-ish ground that you could find. Well, certainly that I'm aware of in Sark. But it's absolutely fascinating tour. Still a few places left. When I emailed Tim at the weekend, just to check if he still had spaces, I thought it was worth giving it a mention to anybody locally who might want to go on it. It's a full day walking around Sark and stopping for lunch.
Yeah, so if you're on Guernsey on the 25th of May and you fancy being involved in this, basically what happens is you go across the Sark on Sark shipping. What time of the day are you going?
It's on the first boat in the morning, which I think is 8:30 that day.
Something like that. Yep.
But if you go to Tim's Guided Walks on Facebook, not only will you find lots of really, really interesting information about the occupation, you'll also find this walk and how to book it. So yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm taking some guided tours that day, another part of the island, so I won't be able to go. But I'm sure if people make themselves known to you, you'll be able to bring.
I can put them in touch if
yeah.
needs be. Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, Tim really knows his stuff. I've been on various things with him, and it's just the level of research that he does. It is amazing.
Yeah, highly recommended. Okay, so also, how's your Island Fortress blog going? You've had some amazing activity. Did you tweet that there's been a spike of activity?
Yeah, there's been a huge spike in activity on the blog, which is good to see, from all over the world. So the top readership is the UK, followed by Guernsey, but then closely followed by the USA. But yeah, getting loads and loads of hits on the blog. I'm going to have actually a podcast related one out shortly, which is just, we talked about the speech that Sherwell gave back in August 1940. So I've got a little blog about that coming up shortly.
Okay, so next week, or not next week, but next fortnight, this program will be going out on Monday evening, but of course you'll be listening to it when it goes out. Excuse me, but we'll be moving on to January 1941, a new year in the occupation. I think the diaries of Louis Guillemette, I think, might kick in January 40, but I'll be writing our script up for then next week.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when they.
It's January or February 41, but we look forward to Louis Guillemette being a liaison between the German authorities and our civil authorities over here. So yeah, I mean, get in touch with us if you're interested in Tim's tour to Sark with Nick. I mean, Nick will be a great travelling companion to anybody that wants to go over. I mean, Tim will have quite a few people.
Oh, I'm sure he will. Yeah. As I say, I checked with him before we mentioned it, because I didn't want to mention it and then find out he had no spaces. But he has got a few spaces left, and as I say, it is a really, really interesting tour. It's a nice walk, if aside from all of the other bits and pieces, the knowledge that you find out and visit some incredible places.
Good. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps us up for this week, and we'll play out with a little bit of Jim Delbridge. We'll be back with you in a fortnight for December 1941. Remember, if you wish to get in touch with us, occupied@gnetradio.com, and when we come back in a fortnight's time, I will have some information to give you about some music-related programs linked to this podcast. So it's thank you and goodbye from Keith, and also from Nick.
Thanks very much, Keith, for doing all the script and things for us in advance of the programme, asking all those questions for me to answer.
Yeah, it's great fun as always. Anyway, bye-bye to you all. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew what was to come. But someone had to stay to carry on. Austin's Fort Morris is abandoned on the quay, and the children crossed the sea and became evacuees. Locked up shops and houses with no one left inside, as everybody tried to get away. It's 5 to 7. Winston went and left us on our own. Classified, demilitarized zone. But nobody told Hitler on on the phone. He might have left us all alone.